Hello, welcome to the presentation. We're here to hear Erik Beever talk about American pikas in the Columbia River Gorge. And I'm going to give a little bit of introduction. This is Stephen Zylstra. I'm with Fish and Wildlife Service in our regional office in Portland, Oregon. Erik has been kind enough to come down here from, he works for the USGS in the Northern Rocky Science Center in Bozeman, Montana. And he's decided to come on down and give us a presentation here in Portland and then put this online so you all can participate. I want to give you just a little bit of background about Erik. He's been a researcher for a while. He got a Bachelor's of Science of Biological Sciences in USC Davis in '93. He did his PhD in Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology at University of Nevada, Reno in '99. His specialties are disturbance ecology, mechanisms of biological response to climate, and monitoring landscapes. He tells me he's worked in with a lot of different types of organisms and ecosystems, so he's got a nice diverse background. He also, before coming to USGS in 2000, he worked as an INM, inventory and monitoring ecologist for the National Park Service. So he's got a nice diverse background, and I'm really interested to hear what he has to say today. Erik.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a real treat for me to have the opportunity to speak with you all. As Stephen alluded, I spent 6 years in the PNW at the Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center down in Corvallis. So special place in my heart for not only the gorge, but for the Pacific Northwest. I wonder sometimes if all the inhabitants of the greater Portland metro area realize what an amazing resource they have literally at their doorstep, simply to the east in the gorge. I'm going to give you kind of a diversity of images to show you some insights into that and to kind of describe why we're asking some of these questions, what questions we're asking, how we're going about that, and what I've seen as, first of all, the results to date, what I think the implications are, what we found, and can't give the implications of what we haven't yet analyzed, but so I think just to start off, what's striking is this idea of interior range edge. The American pika goes from British Columbia down to New Mexico and the southern edge of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. So for such a broadly distributed species, the recent trend to use ecological niche models to understand species relationships to climate for kind of effectively a third to a half of the continent, it's a little bit difficult for me to be convinced that species are going to be interacting with climate in a uniform manner across that whole region. In the case of the gorge, this isn't really on the range edge in a geographic sense, in terms of the species geographic range, but it is, in fact, the lowest elevation occurrence of pikas in this country, and arguably across their whole range. And so just kind of thinking explicitly about what that means to be at an interior range edge as it pertains to understanding management and conservation amidst climate change. So the map for today's talk, I'm going to talk first about climate in terms of the patterns of it, what we've seen in terms of change, and then get a little bit specifically into potential diversity of species responses to climate change and variability. Go through the questions that are underlying our specific research, describe the methods that we're using in that work, some of the results, and then some surprising stuff that we found in terms of behavioral plasticity, and then finish with implications for management and conservation. So, as you all know, at multiple resolutions, spatially and temporally, climate varies. At the broadest extent and resolution, at the continental scale, things such as coastal to continental gradients are important, the jet stream, all these different oscillations from the Arctic oscillation, the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the North Atlantic, and then latitudinal gradients. Things are colder as you move towards the poles. This diagram here on the right shows the fact that how rapidly temperature changes as you move up slope, even that varies across the landscape. And this is a very gross characterization But you can see that in some places it's quicker than others, more rapidly changes as you gain elevation. At finer resolutions, other climate changes with respect to elevation, and then on the windward and the leeward side, as you know, west slope of the Cascades is totally different from the east slope. And then finally, things that don't appear in these ecological niche models, but we all know when we're seeing species out in the landscape, these are hugely important. What aspect you're at, how strong is the sun hitting you? Is it a north-facing versus a south-facing? How much sun that gets? In terms of even finer scales, are they associated with little pools of water or rock ice features, where there's ice down in the rocks? Are they associated with caves or lava tubes? From a topographic perspective, this idea of the cold air pooling, where there's kind of a natural basin and cold air can pool, and then inversion layers as well. These are all important for species heterogeneously distributed across the landscape. Not only is climate variable across the Earth's surface, how much its climate has changed across the surface is also variable. Across the West, we see that some places have actually become cooler. These blue parts from the earlier part of the 20th century to the early part of the 21st century have become cooler, whereas most places are getting warmer. And these darkest red places on the right are actually where the climate has increased the most. That spatial heterogeneity also exists across North America, with the northern latitudes exhibiting greater amounts of change, as well as worldwide. And again, the northern hemisphere has experienced greater magnitudes of increase in temperature. What's interesting and makes the investigation of species-climate relationships even more challenging and nuanced is that if we look, for example, in one species across the southeastern United States, these are fine-scaled distributional patterns of their density across the landscape. And in terms of understanding the factors that describe or predict where they are in the landscape, you can see that the different portions of the species range in a multivariate characterization, those do not overlap at all. So the factors predicting where they are in the landscape in different portions of their range are very different. So generally, what can species do in the face of environmental change and variability? As amphibians have been found, even over relatively short time scales, to have evolved in their tolerance to heat, particularly in the egg stage. From the gorge, that picture. This is I don't know if it's a special helmet, but the wood rat is wearing an eye button helmet, and wood rats, over the course of millennia, have been known to change their body size to accommodate different ambient temperatures. So smaller body temperatures, smaller body sizes in hotter climates over millennia. Other species, such as ungulates, we know well that they have summer ranges and winter ranges. They migrate seasonally. Something we're increasingly seeing now is that individuals may die or emigrate. In some cases, it doesn't make too much of a difference, but we go from a distribution here that was centered around 1,600 meters, now that elevational distribution is around 1,900 meters. And this would be on the left, lower left quadrant, was the distribution with black being the highest density and white being the butterflies not occupying, to a much more reduced in the lower right. Those were butterflies in Spain. Closer to home here in the Sierra Nevada mountain range near Yosemite National Park, folks at UC Berkeley went back to some transects that were surveyed in the early 20th century by Joseph Grinnell and his team, and they found quite a diversity of species responses in terms of their range limit changes Some expanded upwards, expanded their elevational range upwards in elevation. These low elevation species. Some species contracted in the second group here, where the red elevations are those that the species no longer occupies. And then in the no change group, really there hasn't been much change in number of species. So really underscoring the fact that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of response to climate change. Looking back into the past, among mammals, for example, the evidence that we have from, for example, from the pre-glacial period to the glacial time, we saw in terms of the change in size of the geographic range, how much did the geographic range expand or contract, all over the map. Some of them increased dramatically, some species ranges increased dramatically, some species stayed about the same, and some species shrunk their distribution pretty dramatically. Which way did the species geographic range move? Or how far, pardon me. Some species didn't move at all, and some species moved over 3,000 kilometers. So vast shifts. And then also, which direction did they shift? From the pre-glacial to the glacial period. Some went to the west, here at 90 degrees. Some went to the east, and then all different azimuths. So to think that things are only going to be moving upslope and northward is an oversimplification of what's happened in the past and what species are doing now. This is also the same deal in terms of going from the glacial to the Holocene. We see a diversity of responses in each of these three categories. Kind of a more classic perspective, you see that in the early 1900s, this gray region was the region occupied by the elephant, and then for different reasons, in 1989, only these darkly shaded places where the elephant existed. Another thing that species can do in the face of environmental change is to select different portions of the niche across space and through time. You can select more favorable habitats and microhabitats, such as you can be dug in underneath a leaf litter, you can be in the shade, you can be closer to water or near ice caves, using northern versus southern aspects. Talked about that a little bit earlier. You can also change the timing throughout the year of your various life history events. You can change the timing of bud burst, when your leaves come out, when you breed. Amphibians have done that quite a bit. When you give birth, when you leave for migration, when you arrive, and when you emerge from hibernation. And then even within the period of a day, you can change when times you're active. And this is really pretty amazing to me. Even before they're born, some Chinese researchers looking at a soft-shelled turtle, this is the embryo inside the egg cut out. And this is an example of flexibility. So when the heat source is kind of out here facing down towards the one on the left, upper left, the turtle orients its body so as to kind of capture as much of that heat as possible. When they experimentally here, where it says here this heat source shift, when they experimentally move that heat source and light to the left side of the egg, you see that the turtle orients its body to, again, capture that heat. So pretty neat. Well, what's also neat is that turtles have temperature-dependent sex determination, so it's a pretty neat thing. Okay, so I give away the fact that I'm a biology nerd. Why I think pikas are cool? Well, first of all, they eat their own feces, both to conserve water and increase their nutrition efficiency. So if you think that's cool, you are certifiably a biologist. And I think human society would be pretty darn interesting if we had to use cheek gland rubbing to mark our territories. You can kind of imagine that cartoon. Their vocalizations are used for up to 7 different functions. Everything from kind of attracting mates to guarding territory to letting other pikas know about predators coming around. and mother-daughter vocalizations as well. Which is rare for montane and mountain-dwelling species. They're active year-round, so quite an interesting life choice, we might say, in terms of energetics, behavior, etc. What's really nice, relative to, say, fishers or martens or really almost any other wildlife species, they're very, very tightly associated with talus. That makes it nice for us people that can't think totally like an animal to know where they're going to be. And they don't move very far typically, which leads to some radiation. And so as you can see here, they're active year-round. And here's their geographic range, going up from BC and Alberta down to California, Utah, and New Mexico. And I argue that they're a model species for both research and monitoring. They're locally abundant, which is rare for a lot of mammals. They have relatively stable population sizes, unlike these microteens that are super noisy and eruptive. They're highly detectable, and again, they're kind of a weird mammal in this sense. Most mammals are around the teens to 40% detectable. Most researchers have found that they're above 90% detectable using double counts. This is nice because it means that both monitoring and research are less expensive per data point. Living in talus, last I checked, talus fields are not the most desirable place to live, plant your house, for humans at least. So which is nice that we have this ability to look at distributional changes without confounding that by habitat change. That's the main cause for most species declines. Everybody in ecological services has seen that time and time again, habitat loss and degradation. This is not the case here. So we have this pretty, in most cases, strong, pure influence of climate. In some parts of the range, they are changing their distribution. The questions that are underlying our hypotheses. First of all, where are the talus patches that might be occupied by pikas? They only inhabit talus or scree places that have a certain rock diameter. Anything from about 8 inches of rock diameter to 40 inches is what they like. So where are those? Which of those patches are occupied by pikas? And is this pattern stable across years? What factors are driving the pattern of where they are throughout the gorge? We're also understanding density in the gorge and what factors influence their densities across the gorge. And how do temperature and relative humidity vary, both within the gorge, both spatially and temporally? And this essentially helps broaden the study beyond pikas because as individuals in this room can attest, there are many places in the gorge that are darn hard to get to. And so we're really characterizing, I'll show you where these are in the slides to come, characterizing the microclimates of the gorge, both sides and about a 50 to 60 mile wide swath. So pretty valuable for things other than pikas. And then we're also taking, passively getting hair samples from pikas to understand how isolated or connected individuals are from across the gorge, to understand whether there's going to be an issue with connectivity down the road in terms of isolating them and having bottleneck kinds of things. And then understanding, are there any factors that affect isolation? So we've defined the sampling unit as the talus patch, and that's any talus that has to be separated by at least 25 meters, which is about the diameter of a home range, from all other patches. And we use some criteria to ensure that we're not double counting individuals by the same counter, and then we quantify search effort by how many 50-meter transects we've walked. We use paired observer distance sampling to quantify detectability, and that also helps us understand the density. And we've set out these, here's a eye button temperature sensor. We set those and hobo sensors in both pika occupied and unoccupied taluses to understand the conditions that they can handle and the conditions that they can't handle. And then we check and once we detect them, and we know that they're there. If we don't detect them, we go back to make sure that they're indeed not there. And we have a gratuitous picture of the waterfall. It doesn't really give too much relevance to the field methods, but the things that we collect at each point: elevation, the slope gradient, the aspect, and then we use ocular estimation to understand the vegetation cover within that home range area, and how big is the patch, as defined by the number of territories that are there of correct rock diameter. And we don't measure these in the field, but we can get them derived later, both climatic water balance measures, I'll talk about those more in a little bit, and then landscape ecology measures, such as isolation. This is also here on the right, upper right here. These are things that are unique to this region that I've not sampled or ever measured that anywhere else. That I think is an important reason how pikas are here. Percent shade, percent moss cover of the patch, and then mean moss thickness. And my colleague Joe Varner from the University of Utah has done some experiments where she's increased moss cover or removed moss cover and shown that it's has a huge several centigrade degrees effect on temperatures on the surface of the rock. So, and in fact, she's also shown that they have a huge part of their diet is moss, which is, in fact, 60% as I recall. So this generalist herbivore is actually specializing in moss. And I'm actually continue to be amazed by this three-dimensional world of wonder and gradients in the gorge. We have 4 different kinds of gradients going on. North-facing Oregon side of the gorge, cooler. The south-facing Washington side in general is drier and warmer. As you go across the Cascades and change your longitude, that has effects on both precipitation and relative humidity, with it being the highest near the crest of the Cascades. And then elevation, which has a lapse rate. As you go higher in elevation, things get cooler. And then also, if you think about what the Columbia River itself is, a huge body of water, it also has an associated column of air near it, this cold air. So as you move farther away from that, things get warmer as well. And so you can see down here's the Columbia here, and you can see these patterns of vegetation. And here's another colleague, Carlo Abruzzese, here in the room. And you can see in this part of the Washington side, this is the power line here. Things are a bit drier. And then here's just another perspective of the gorge. Given how steep the gorge is, we decided to stay safe, and it's slippery much of the year as well. So we've effectively restricted our sampling and also to conserve native habitats. We've restricted our surveying area to a census of talus patches along trails and roads in the gorge. You don't want to be falling off places like this or there. So we're going to be sampling those. So how do we know if they're there, if pikas are there? Well, unless you're Nietzsche, if you see the animal, it is in fact there. If you hear the animal, as shown by Exhibit A here, they are in fact there. And in some cases, this is from a different region, but this is what a hay pile can look like. They're much less conspicuous in the gorge, and not all individuals seem to have them. The higher up in the gorge you are, the more likely they are to have a hay pile. And they're actually haying moss, which is interesting. But there's been some folks that have hypothesized about why hay piles are not as common in the gorge. How do we know that they used to be there? Well, again, your biologist went. Pikas actually and like all lagomorphs, have 2 different kinds of scat. They have this moist species down in the lower left corner that they re-ingest, and then they produce these dry fecal pellets. And then there are old hay piles here on the right as well. Here are those climatic water balance metrics that we're looking at to see whether these are affecting pikas occupancy or density, actual evapotranspiration, water deficit, growing season precipitation, and then maximum snow water equivalent. And this is the pattern of both available water and the pattern of evapotranspiration throughout the course of the year. So what were our hypotheses? On a very simple level, we hypothesized that the distribution of pikas would extend farther west and east on the north-facing Oregon side than on the south-facing Washington side. We predicted higher densities on the Oregon side, and we predicted that microclimatic factors would more strongly affect distribution and abundance than would amount of talus habitat, which is kind of not intuitive in the sense that, duh, animals need habitat, but from the work that we found in other places, amount of habitat is really not all of the equation, and not even the main part of the equation. So the result, well, in terms of where we have placed the relative humidity sensors, you can see that they go from the unoccupied parts in Troutdale out to beyond where pikas exist, well beyond Hood River, both on the Oregon side and on the Washington side. We've emphasized low elevations. We added another one of those. This year we're going to be adding some more as well. And this one, these yellow sensors, are the ones that are temperature only. We added an additional 22 of those last year, and so far we've upped that total with another 9 temperature sensors. The ones that have relative humidity are a lot more expensive, so we can't put those everywhere, which would be nice to be able to. And you can see here that the land use mosaic is quite heterogeneous, these different colors of jurisdictions. It makes getting to some of these places challenging. So in terms of where we have and have not found them, it's a little bit inverse in terms of the color that you would use, but the red places are where we have found pikas. You can see that's pretty well distributed across both sides of the gorge, but indeed they go farther on both sides on the Oregon side. And what's also nice, we did confirm that densities were higher on the Oregon side, and that the densities are about 5 to 15 times higher in the gorge than in the Great Basin. I haven't finished quantifying that, but pretty clearly that's the case. Another interesting thing is talk about a low-tech method. Philippe Henry from University of British Columbia thought, well, why don't I just put out some packing tape, just kind of generic packing tape in and around where these things live, and then when the pikas move pass by this packing tape, kind of pillars of packing tape, passively hairs are caught by the packing tape. When the hairs stick to the packing tape, there's a teeny bit of hair follicle on the end of those hairs. We can actually amplify the DNA from that to understand what the relationship of these animals are, how related they are. So I've hypothesized that the Columbia River, Oregon versus Washington side, will be the strongest barrier to dispersal. It'd be cool to see this the 17th century landslide where they had that'd be, if we could get that signal, I'd be really happy. We'll see if that happens. Or maybe they're going across the Cascade Lock Bridge. I don't know. And I bet that there's going to be better dispersal and connectivity on the Oregon side than on the Washington side for a given similar distance. And I also hypothesized that moving along the same elevational contour would be easier than moving up elevation or down elevation for the same distance. So we last year collected 58 genetic samples from about 7 different sites, and I'm collaborating with Mike Russello of UBC Okanagan campus, and his team collected about over 300 samples from 13 sites. So it's been a real pleasure to work in the gorge. We've got working with a lot of different folks from a lot of different states, federal, county and university, as well as college collaborators. And you can see here kind of the full net of what we've got in terms of sensors and detections is pretty extensive. And this is only from last year. I haven't added this year's. We're going to have a pretty good coverage of the gorge. And okay, so what? I think first and kind of most broadly applicable is that this provides a robust snapshot, and honestly a census along trails of not only climate, but wildlife and plants. We take the vegetation cover at all these sites across the entire gorge, where we can get to on public land. And I feel so strongly about this understanding of the mechanisms by which the how and why questions that describe species relationships to climate that was kind of the whole focus of a book that I edited in 2012. Because if we don't know how and why species are being affected, it's really difficult to know what to do in terms of conservation or management actions. And I would argue that at the range edge, whether it's an interior range edge or a geographic range edge, those are especially informative because that's right, as you cross that boundary, we can understand which factors are creating the boundary of occupancy. And this also provides the Cascades Pika Watch group that has folks from across the entire Cascades and even farther flung, using both kind of citizen scientists as well as researchers. This is going to be a systematic sample of all patches in the gorge that are able to be accessed from trails and roads. So we can use that as a template against which to measure future changes in both distribution and density through time. And I would argue that the work raises the awareness of the unique nature of the gorge and its biotas, both nationally and internationally. And through asking those how and why questions, it may give us insights into both conservation and management actions to consider. Should there be declines that begin? We don't have a sense historically of any systematic nature where pikas were in the gorge, but this can help us. And then in terms of comparing this study with pikas in other parts of the country, I think it really gives us a multiple scale understanding of what's driving distributions and changes in distribution. And I wanted to kind of end with some really hopeful notes. From farther north in the species range, if you go back to your physics class, the best shape for conserving heat is you want to try to reduce your surface area for a given amount of volume, that surface area to volume ratio. The best way to conserve heat is to be in a ball. It turns out that a grade school teacher from Calgary, sent me some pictures. In winter, funny enough, almost all the pictures he sent me looks like a pika ball. In the summer, sunken, splayed out, they're emitting a lot of heat. This is a much more efficient posture. So this behavioral flexibility allows them in a place where cold stress is likely to be pretty important for the species distribution. They have that flexibility. And as I said, the frequency of the ball posture is very different between the seasons. In the gorge, something that blew me away is they're underneath the forest and sometimes not even on the talus. And I'm guessing that how frequently they're underneath the forest and in the adjacent non-talus areas, we're hypothesizing that's a function of temperature, elevation, time of day, and what is it summer versus later in the year. And my colleague Joe Varner is also looking at that as well. Another interesting thing up in the Bull Run, we detected pikas in this lakeside, I wouldn't call it talus, but rocky shore. They've also been found in the PNW in river riprap, in slash piles of wood, in standing dead trees, in downed logs, and under tree branches. And we put out some paired sensors and found that they're pretty moderating kinds of situations there. So helping them kind of moderating the climate for the animals. We found them down to 42 meters elevation, very, very low. And they've been off the talus about half the time. And I mentioned, Joe has found that moss cover both provides natural insulation as well as food items. And sorry that I flipped the years. Here's other results. In 2012, we detected 179 individuals at 78 different locations and found 27 patches to be unoccupied. And we have very strong stability. If a patch is unoccupied 1 year, it's very consistently unoccupied the next year. If it's occupied 1 year, it's occupied the next year as well. And then for the 2013, we have just begun, 92 individuals at 57 locations and 10 unoccupied patches. And kind of finishing up, things on the horizon for us. I just began collaborations with someone from Mount Holyoke College using a plane to sense both the vegetation and temperature at very, very high resolution on the scale of less than an inch resolution pictures, which is amazing. So the idea there is to think, okay, there's way too much habitat across the West to be able to go physically to every place, and be able to fly over it once we get an understanding of which temperatures and vegetation signatures they do and do not occupy. Kind of uses as I would say, like a proactive way to sample where we think they might be. These water balance measures I already talked about. Both these physiological and genetic studies, I think, will be areas of fruitful work in the future. And then looking at multiple different scales simultaneously, I think, is valuable. With that, I wanted to thank Joe Varner and Carlo Albertizzi, Stephen Clark, Daniel Verganis, and all the folks on this slide for their various contributions, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. David, do you want to mention about the questions?
Yeah, this is David. I'll be monitoring the chat function if you have, for those folks on WebEx that have questions. And I could open up the phone lines and unmute all the lines from this end, but I would ask that everyone on your end of the phone, if you could unmute your phones if you're not speaking. So you'll have either option. But why don't we start here in the regional office and let folks, give them a little bit of time for the chat and unmuting their phones.
Any questions? Okay.
What's the smallest talus patch size you found them in, and how far from talus have you found them ranging before?
And Erik, can you repeat the questions for the callers?
The questions were, what's the smallest talus patch that you found them in? And the second question was, how far from talus have you found them? So the first question, I believe we've found them in a patch as small as 2 home ranges. So, and we were calling that home range about 20, 22 meters diameter. So a couple of those. And in fact, if an area does not have 1 home range of habitat, we don't even consider it a patch. The second question is a great question because they're not just anywhere. They're within 100 meters of the talus. And yeah, probably within 75 meters most of the time.
Mute off.
Steven.
Given the climate change aspect of this, do you have an idea of how long these populations have inhabited these areas, the lower elevation areas, and if there's been some changes in, say, the last 20, 30 years.
We don't have the data to say in the last 20 or 30 years. It's remarkable to me that they are this low. My guess, if I had to look into a crystal ball, I think it's going to be any changes that we do see will be mediated by these aspects of climatic water balance. The places that we saw really low density are in these places that are the hotter, drier parts of the gorge. For example, Ruffle Creek on the Oregon side. You got oaks in the middle of the gorge where there's kind of really on both sides we have conifers. And I'm not quite sure why there's that local dry patch, but you know, we found one over many, many transects. Over longer time scales, there isn't the fossil record that exists in other parts of the West, but I would hypothesize pretty clearly that there's been an expansion and contraction following the glacial ice ages as well.
Any questions on the line? Anyone on the phone? No? Okay. Go ahead.
How do these animals disperse? Like they live, they're highly territorial.
And they typically live male, female, male, female.
And then the young are dispersed away from the adults at a certain age. And how far do the young go?
Not at all. In the gorge, we don't know. I would argue that for this species and for other species, dispersal ability is going to be context dependent. The best studies of dispersal and connectivity are from the most ideal habitats, kind of high elevation in the Rockies and Sierras, what they call the mainland in the biogeographic speak. No one has done it from the hot, dry places from the Great Basin, and I bet you they're not nearly as strong with their dispersal capacity. People have assumed that they're essentially well isolated on those mountaintop islands. In the gorge, I would bet as well that, as you saw in my hypothesis, I think dispersal is going to be a lot stronger on the Oregon side than the Washington side. But we don't really know, but the studies that have been done, they don't move hardly at all. In terms of watching focal animals, marked animals with ear tags, 300 meters, even in the Sierras and the Rockies, was a pretty rare event. So they're not, in those, genetic work suggests that there are occasional individuals that move, you know, when researchers aren't up there, probably in the winter, making these long-distance chugs to other places. In the gorge, I kind of have mixed feelings about how to think about that. So I'm really pretty anxious to see how that. We're not only going to be looking at distances and elevations, we're going to be looking at particular environmental correlates that may facilitate or impede dispersal as well. So maybe it's super steep slopes that they just can't get around, or maybe it's proximity to water, you know, vertical creeks that facilitates things. So lots of, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think's going on.
I've got a site that totally stumps me. So we've got a few sightings starting in 2009. 45 miles northeast of Seattle in a Jim Creek Basin. And we've seen an animal or two so far. But the talus slopes are 40 meters would be a big patch of talus.
Really?
The rest of it's forest.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting. And then there's kind of no, as you can say, no quote-unquote talus mainland that you're aware of.
Correct. That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. That's really interesting. Yes?
What's the reproductive rate and recruitment? Or, I mean, seems like they have really limited ranges and the kids' density
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Sorry. He asked what is the reproductive rate and recruitment of Pikas, and you would think, and one thing I didn't mention that folks, I and other folks have written about as a potential factor leading to their vulnerability in some parts of their range is that their resting body temperature is only 3 Celsius degrees different from their upper lethal body temperature. So 40.3 is their resting body temperature, 43.3. Wow. So super narrow range. So funny enough, they're a homeotherm, endotherm that needs to be regulated. In terms of, as a lagomorph, you think, wow, rabbits are really productive. Fecund. These guys are actually one of the least fecund lagomorphs.
Well, given the resources, I could understand that.
Yeah. So they can have 2 litters a year. That's pretty rare that they do have 2 litters a year. I think it's 2.3 offspring per litter. And like
lifespan?
Up to 7 years, I think 2 or 3 is the mean. They don't do well in captivity at all. It's kind of embarrassing when you look at the numbers of when they've taken them out of the field. They're like, oh, well, out of the 6 that we removed, 1 lived past the first day. So yeah, which makes the idea of translocation logistically really challenging. And really, there's one person that the researchers trust in terms of handling them. Everyone else kind of goes to her to get that method dialed in. I think it's about 2.5 per litter. As good lagomorphs, they can actually resorb a litter. If environmental conditions don't warrant another litter, we'll resorb those nutrients. Great question.
Any questions on the phone? Lines are open.
I have another question if no one else is going to step up. Since I work in science applications, I'm always concerned about the application of research and how that's going to help us make decisions. You and I have talked a little bit about this research on the side, but I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you think this information can translate into helping us consider behavioral plasticity and how these species related species can adapt as the environment continues to change through climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I had a couple of slides up there, and I think the nuance, kind of the balanced answer in this regard is that I think in some cases their species will have this flexibility to accommodate climatic changes. The answer is not, however, that, every species has unlimited capacity and resilience to handle all this stuff, because I don't think that is the case. There clearly are hard physiological, metabolic thresholds beyond which species can't take it. And I think what we're trying to understand is which factors are those on and what are those levels. And do those factors vary across the range? And I think at this low elevation, understanding for this species what's really limiting them, that'll help us understand whether we can do anything from a management and conservation perspective. And if we can, what would that be? I think, understanding how climate varies across the gorge, and where, if there would be refugia, are the places that we would need to protect in the gorge, microclimatic refugia. Are there any, from a genetic perspective, are there any genetic, any populations genetically that are really distinct or isolated from the other parts of the gorge? And then understand, again, do we need to do anything about it, or should we be concerned from a conservation ecological services perspective as the work is continued to the Cascades Pika Watch, and coming back again into the future, are things changing? And if so, where and why? And I think that really informs what we can do about it. And hopefully, as other studies in the gorge like this come about as well, we might see some concordance across the studies in terms of what's driving patterns and then patterns of change.
Thank you.
Yes.
When the pika are moving out of the talus areas into the forested areas, do you know what their behavior is? I'm curious whether they're seeking those areas for moss. Is it high amount of their diet or not?
Actually, I would probably defer to Jo a little bit because she's doing a ton, like hundreds, if not thousands of hours of observational data. My guess is that it's purely a temperature regulation, function of temperature regulation, that it's cooler under the, so in the forest is shaded, cooler microclimates, and we're seeing that, they're out in the talus, kind of in the open sky, early in the morning, and then the hotter times of the day is when they're more underneath the talus. Do you have anything to add to that, Jo?
I guess the only thing I would add is that two things. First is that it's really hard to observe them in the forest because it's all under a really dense understory. So we can hear them call, but we can't really see what they're doing. And the second is that I think that relationships can vary between sites. So there are some sites that have lots and lots of vegetation on the talus, and that at those sites it's cooler on the talus than it is in the forest, and there's a lot of food. But at some of the sites that have a lot less vegetation, it's cooler in the forest than it is in the talus, and there's not a lot of food on the talus. So it could be, I think that temperature and food availability are probably both linked.
When you look for them in the forest, you're mostly doing it by call, and then is there a hay pile evidence or a moss pile evidence that you feed in on?
I have never detected hay piles in the forest, but I can't say that I've put in a very extensive search effort for hay piles in the forest. So I've seen one animal in the forest far away from talus, but most of the times that we detect them off of the talus is by call, just because it's pretty thick under there. Yeah.
Same for me, ditto. But yeah, how thick it is off the talus varies as well.
Right.
What's the closest and easiest place to go see one of these critters from Portland?
I hesitate to recommend Multnomah Falls Trail because you might get trampled on the way. But what is it? The sign for switchback 4 of 11 on that trail. They're right as you're going out. They're right on the left. That talus patch there. So actually, the easiest one is Angel's Rest Trailhead.
Okay.
So they're on the very first talus patch, so literally 15 minutes from the trailhead.
Okay.
And so they're, and that's a really excellent example too. They're in the trees, apparently not even on the talus. So there's some rocks in the place where they are, but you wouldn't call it talus per se. And there's a bigger slide, and that was one of only 2 places where we've seen a change in, I've seen a change in occupancy. The second slide, which is kind of downhill above someone's home, pretty well above their home. There was no one in 2011. In 2012, there was 1 juvenile that came in and was occupying that. And then, as well as on the 3rd and 4th ones up the trail, they're there.
Do they vocalize consistently throughout the year?
I haven't been here as much in other times. Jo has. They're not nearly as vocal in other parts of their range in fall.
Okay.
What's your experience?
My experience is that they are not nearly as vocal, and that they don't come out as much in other times of the year.
Surface active.
Yeah, but I think it may also, I have a lot of data to suggest that they're not active in the rain. And I'm done collecting that data. Yeah. And so since it is raining most of the rest of the time of the year, it may just be that they don't like sitting out in the rain, and I don't either, so.
So have you seen them run for cover when it starts raining, or?
Yeah, we will see them be out active, and if it's just kind of sprinkly misting, they'll be out, and then as soon as it starts really raining, they all just go back under the rocks.
It could be even like a pelage-mediated thing. If there's too much rain, the insulative properties of their pelage, their hair.
Mm-hmm.
Any last questions?
What do these taste like? So this is amazing. Actually, in Alaska, which is a different species, they actually you can legally hunt them. I lived in Alaska for a couple of years, and that's kind of, I would say that's consistent with some politics.
This is being recorded.
Well, I'll rephrase it, any serious questions? Larry. So anyway, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you very much, Erik, for coming down. Appreciate it. Hi, Rob.